The Brazos River doesn't give back what it takes. Down in Cedar Falls, Texas, everyone knew that. It was a cold, greedy river that swallowed secrets, horses, and sometimes people. And on this night, under a sliver of a moon that offered no comfort, Sheriff Royce Dean was about to feed it a 19-year-old girl. Her name was Sylvia Kay, and her only crime was saying no. From the shadows of the livery stable, a man named Harlan Roy watched the torch-lit procession snake its way toward the water's edge. He wasn't from here. He was just a ghost passing through, a man who'd spent 14 years trying to outrun a memory. But tonight, that memory had caught up. He saw Sylvia's straight-backed figure, her chin held high, and he didn't see a defiant landowner. He saw a girl the same age his own daughter would have been, a girl about to be swallowed by the dark. What happens when a man who has nothing left to lose finally finds something worth fighting for? The answer to that question would tear Cedar Falls apart and expose a rot that went so deep it threatened to poison the entire territory. Stick with me, because this story is about a darkness that wears a silver badge and the two lost souls who dared to drag it into the light. Before we dive in, do me a favor and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy what you're about to hear, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what's coming next. The trouble in Cedar Falls didn't start with a gunshot. It started with a piece of paper. Just a simple, polite letter from Sylvia Kay to Sheriff Royce Dean, turning down his offer of marriage. To anyone else, it was a private matter. But in Dean's town, there were no private matters. There was only his will and those who broke it. Sylvia was the last of her line. The Kay Ranch, her inheritance, was the jewel of the county. 2 miles of the richest riverfront land that could make a man a king. Her father had worked it for 30 years before pneumonia took him, leaving Sylvia all alone. At 19, she had more grit than most men twice her age, but she was still a woman alone. And in that time and place, that was like being a lamb in a wolf den. Sheriff Dean wasn't just any wolf. He was the alpha, a man of 50, with iron gray hair and eyes as cold as a banker's heart. He'd been sheriff for 8 years, long enough to turn the law into his own personal hammer. He saw Sylvia's ranch not as something to be earned, but as something to be taken. And he saw Sylvia as the key. His proposal wasn't about love. It was a business transaction, her land for his protection. When she refused, he didn't argue. He didn't try to court her. He just smiled a smile that didn't reach his eyes and let the whispers begin. He'd visit the general store and talk about how a property that large needed a man's hand. He'd tell folks at the saloon how sad it was that a young girl was struggling under such a burden. He was poisoning the well, turning the town's pity into suspicion. He was building his case, brick by patient brick. The final brick was laid in the town hall. He called a public meeting, claiming it was about community welfare. He stood before the town holding Sylvia's letter of refusal like it was a confession to a murder. "This is not merely a rejection of a marriage proposal," he boomed, his voice filling the stuffy room. "This is an act of defiance, an attack on the very order that keeps us safe." Sylvia stood up, her voice clear and steady. "Sheriff, I meant no disrespect. I simply exercised my right to choose." Dean's face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. "Rights! You have the right to obey the law, to respect your betters, to contribute to the stability of this town. By refusing to place your father's legacy under lawful stewardship, you invite chaos." He let the words hang in the air, letting the fear sink in. Then he reached under his podium and pulled out a coil of thick, greasy rope. A gasp went through the crowd. They all knew what it meant. Dean had a special kind of punishment for those who defied him, a punishment he called river justice. He claimed it was an old frontier tradition, a trial by ordeal. If God believed you were innocent, you'd survive the river. If not, you'd drown. It was clean, simple, and terrifyingly final. In 6 years, 4 people had faced river justice. None had come back. "For the crime of willful defiance and the corruption of public morals," Dean declared, his eyes locked on Sylvia, "I sentence Sylvia Kay to face the judgment of the Brazos River." Silence. Not a soul moved. Not a voice was raised in protest. They were all trapped in the web of fear Dean had spun around them. From the back of the room, Harlan Roy watched it all. He'd only been in town a week, selling a string of horses. He'd seen men like Dean before, bullies who used a badge to hide a rotten soul. He'd spent his life running from confrontations, from attachments, from anything that might hurt. But as he watched them lead Sylvia out of the town hall, something inside him, a part of him he thought had died 14 years ago with his daughter Emma, finally broke free. He slipped out the back door and melted into the darkness, not running away this time, but running toward the river. The procession moved like a funeral march. The whole town followed, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight, silent witnesses to a murder they were all complicit in. Sylvia didn't cry. She didn't beg. She walked with a dignity that seemed to infuriate the sheriff even more. At the riverbank, where the current ran fast and deep, his deputies bound her hands and feet with the rough hemp rope. Dean gave her one last chance. Renounce your foolish pride, girl. Accept my proposal, and I will show you mercy. Sylvia looked not at him, but at the faces in the crowd. The store owner who had known her since she was a baby. The school teacher who had taught her to read. The liveryman who had helped her father break horses. She saw fear in their eyes, nothing more. I forgive you, she said, her voice carrying over the rush of the water. I forgive you all. And with a shove, she was gone. The cold black water of the Brazos swallowed her whole. The crowd let out a collective gasp, and then a heavy silence fell. Sheriff Dean stood there for a long moment, a grim smile on his face. Justice, he believed, had been served. His problem had been solved. But he was wrong, because a quarter-mile downstream, hidden by a thicket of cottonwood trees, Harlan Roy was already wading into the icy current. He wasn't a hero. He was a broken man, a drifter, who traded horses and tried to drink away the past. His entire life was packed into 2 worn saddlebags, clothes, a tin coffee pot, and at the very bottom, a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Letters from a little girl named Emma. Letters he hadn't been able to read in over a decade. Emma would have been 20 this year. The scarlet fever had taken her at 7, while Harlan was 300 miles away on a cattle drive. His wife, consumed by grief, had blamed him. If you were here, her goodbye note had said, she might have lived. For 14 years, that guilt had been his only companion. It had driven him from town to town, job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. He came to Cedar Falls every spring, a familiar stop on his endless, lonely circuit. He knew the town, he knew the people, and he knew Sheriff Dean was a snake. He just never thought it was his fight, until now. Watching Sylvia fall into that river was like watching Emma die all over again. It was a failure he could actually do something about. The current was strong, pulling Sylvia downstream faster than he'd expected. He ran along the bank, stumbling over roots and rocks, his eyes straining in the dark. He knew this stretch of the river. He knew about the bend a few hundred yards down, where a tangle of fallen trees and sandbars created a treacherous but slower channel. If he could get there first, he might have a chance. His lungs burned. His heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't running from a memory anymore. He was racing it. He reached the bend just as he saw her, a pale shape tumbling in the dark water, her head barely breaking the surface. She was caught on a submerged log. He didn't hesitate. He plunged into the freezing river, the shock of the cold stealing his breath. The current tore at him, trying to drag him under, but he fought his way to her side. Got you, he grunted, grabbing a fistful of her soaked dress. His knife, always sharp, sliced through the wet ropes at her wrists and ankles. She was limp in his arms, barely conscious. He dragged her through the sucking mud and onto the bank, collapsing beside her, both of them coughing up river water and shivering uncontrollably. He pulled off his dry-wool jacket and wrapped it around her, then half-carried her to a small, hidden hollow in the riverbank, shielded from the wind by a curtain of willows. He worked with a grim efficiency, gathering dry tinder and starting a small, smokeless fire. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackle of the flames and the distant, mocking murmur of the river that was supposed to have been her grave. Finally, she looked at him, her eyes wide in the firelight. Why? She whispered, her voice raw. You don't even know me. Harlan stared into the fire, the flames dancing in his tired eyes. For the first time in 14 years, he reached into his jacket, passed the flask of whiskey, and pulled out the small, worn photograph of his daughter. He held it out to her. The picture showed a little girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile. Her name was Emma, he said, his voice thick with an old familiar pain. She would have been your age. In that small hidden hollow, two strangers, one who had lost a daughter and one who had lost her future, began to realize they weren't alone anymore. But their fight was just beginning, because Sheriff Dean was about to discover his problem hadn't drowned. And a man like that doesn't take kindly to problems that come back from the dead. As the first hints of dawn painted the sky a bruised purple, Sylvia's shivering finally subsided. The warmth of the fire in Harlan's jacket had brought the life back into her, but the fear was still there, cold and sharp in her gut. She knew Dean. He wasn't a man who left things to chance. When her body didn't wash up downstream, he would start hunting. And he would be hunting two people now. He won't stop, she said, her voice barely a whisper. This wasn't just about my refusal. There's something else. Something older. Harlan looked at her, seeing the steel beneath the exhaustion. This girl was a survivor. What aren't you telling me? He asked. Sylvia took a deep breath. My mother, before she died, she gave me a small metal box. She told me to keep it safe, to never open it unless I was in terrible danger. She said it held a secret that could destroy a man's life. She reached into a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her dress, her fingers closing around the cold metal. It was still there. She pulled it out. It was a simple tin box, rusted at the hinges. I opened it the day Dean made his proposal. She continued, her hands trembling as she pried open the lid. I thought now was the time. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were two documents. The first was her official land deed, signed and sealed, making her the sole, legal owner of the K Ranch. Harlan nodded. That made sense. But it was the second document that made his blood run cold. It was a marriage certificate, yellowed and brittle with age. The names written in elegant script were Elizabeth Monroe and Royce Dean, her mother, and the sheriff. It was dated 22 years ago, 3 years before Sylvia was even born. But that wasn't the most chilling part. Tucked beneath the certificate was a letter, written in her mother's hand. My dearest Sylvia, it began, if you are reading this, it means Royce has come back into our lives. He was my first husband, a cruel man I fled from just weeks after our wedding. I traveled hundreds of miles, changed my name, and started a new life here in Cedar Falls. Years later, I met your father. I was told Royce had died in a bar fight, so I believed I was free to marry again. I was wrong. Sylvia's voice broke as she read the next part. Royce reappeared when you were just a baby. He found us. He didn't want me back. He wanted money. Your father paid him to disappear, to sign papers legally dissolving the marriage, to never speak of it again. We thought we were safe, but I know him, my daughter. He is a patient viper. He never saw our ranch as a home. He saw it as an asset he was owed. He believes in his twisted mind that because he was married to me first, everything I ever gained, including the land your father built, belongs to him. He's not trying to marry you to get the ranch, Sylvia. He believes the ranch and you are already his property. Harlan stared at the letter, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about greed. It was about a decades-old obsession. Dean hadn't just appeared in Cedar Falls and become sheriff by chance. He had come here for a reason. He had waited patiently for Sylvia's father to die. He had waited for her to be alone and vulnerable. The marriage proposal wasn't a proposal at all. It was an eviction notice. He was reclaiming his property. My God, Sylvia whispered, the full weight of it crashing down on her. My father's pneumonia. It came on so fast. The doctor was baffled. And my mother? She fell from a horse a few years back. A horse she'd ridden for a decade. That was steady as a rock. The unspoken thought hung in the air between them, thick and poisonous. Sheriff Dean hadn't just been waiting. He'd been clearing the board. He hadn't just tried to kill her last night. He had likely murdered both her parents to ensure their secret died with them. He wasn't just a corrupt lawman. He was a monster wearing a star, and he had been hiding in plain sight for years. They were no longer just fugitives. They were the only two people alive who knew the truth. And in Dean's world, people who knew the truth had a habit of ending up in the Brazos River. Back in Cedar Falls, the sun rose on a town full of quiet unease. Sheriff Dean stood on the riverbank, staring at the empty water. His deputies had searched for miles downstream. They'd found nothing. Not a scrap of dress, not a body tangled in the reeds. It was impossible. The Brazos never failed. "She's gone," his deputy, a nervous young man named Calloway, said. "The current must have taken her all the way to the county line." Dean turned slowly, his eyes narrowed to slits. "No," he said, his voice a low growl. "Nothing is that clean." He looked toward the livery stable. He had seen the horse trader, Harlan Roy, watching from the back of the town hall, and he remembered something else. Roy's horses were still in the corral, but the man himself was gone. His gear, his saddle, all vanished. It was a loose thread, and Royce Dean hated loose threads. "Find him," Dean ordered. "Find the horseman. He saw something, or he did something. Find him, and you'll find her." The hunt was on. Harlan and Sylvia knew they couldn't stay hidden by the river for long. Dean's deputies would be scouring every inch of the county. Their only hope was to get back into town, to find someone, anyone, who might help them. It was a long shot. The town was terrified of Dean, but they had the truth on their side, and right now the truth was the only weapon they had. They moved under the cover of darkness, slipping through back alleys and shadowed pastures, their hearts pounding with every dog's bark, every rustle of leaves. Their first stop was the home of Gloria Ann, the town school teacher. She was a spinster in her late 40s, a woman who believed in books and rules, but who also had a core of decency that Dean's reign of terror had not yet extinguished. They found her grading papers by the light of a single lamp. When she saw Sylvia standing in her doorway, alive, she nearly fainted. Sylvia quickly explained everything, showing her the marriage certificate and her mother's letter. Gloria's face went from shock to horror to a slow, burning anger. "I always knew there was a darkness in him," she whispered, her hands trembling. "The way he looks at the older girls in my class. The way people just, disappear when they cross him." She looked at the letter again. "This changes everything. But what can we do? He has the whole town in his pocket." "We need allies," Harlan said, his voice firm. "We need to show this proof to someone else, someone respected." Their next stop was Elwood James, the owner of the general store. Elwood was a man who measured his life in ledgers and inventory, a practical man who avoided trouble. But he had also been a close friend of Sylvia's father. He listened to their story, his face growing paler with every word. He looked at the marriage certificate, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "He's a devil," Elwood muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "We all knew it, but we were too scared to say it. He has ways of making life difficult. A tax audit, a sudden issue with a supply wagon, a rumor that ruins your credit." He looked from Sylvia to Harlan. "Fighting him is suicide." "Not fighting him is worse," Sylvia said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Elwood wrestled with his conscience, his fear warring with his loyalty to his dead friend. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "All right," he said, "I'm in. But we need more than just us. We need someone who can handle himself if things get rough. Someone like Morrison down at the livery." It made sense. Morrison was a former ranger, a tough, quiet man who had seen his share of fights. If anyone in town had the sand to stand up to Dean, it was him. They made their way to the livery stable, the scent of hay and horses a strangely comforting smell in the tense night air. Morrison was in the back, mending a bridle. He looked up as they entered, his face unreadable. Harlan laid out the story for a third time. He showed Morrison the documents. The big man was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the marriage certificate. Harlan watched him closely. There was something in Morrison's eyes he couldn't quite place. Not fear exactly. Something else. Something deeper. "This is bad business," Morrison finally said, his voice a low rumble. "Dean's got deputies everywhere. You can't stay in town. It's a death trap." He looked around the stable. "There's an old line shack, abandoned, about 5 miles west of here. Nobody's been out there in years. You can hide there. I'll bring you food and water after sundown tomorrow. It'll give us time to think, to figure out a plan. It seemed like the perfect solution. A safe place to hide, a strong ally on the outside. Sylvia felt a surge of hope. Harlan, however, felt a prickle of unease. Something was off. Morrison's offer was a little too quick, a little too easy, but they were out of options. They had to trust someone. "Thank you, Morrison," Sylvia said, her voice thick with gratitude. "Don't thank me yet, girl," Morrison said, turning back to his bridle. "Just get out there before the sun comes up." They followed his directions, slipping out of town and into the rolling hills. They found the shack just as he'd described it, a dilapidated hut hidden in a grove of mesquite trees. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. As they settled in to wait, exhausted but hopeful, Sylvia looked at Harlan. "We might actually do this," she said. Harlan didn't answer. He just stared out the grimy window, watching the trail that led back to town, that strange feeling of unease twisting in his gut. He had spent a lifetime learning to read men, and something about Morrison's eyes had screamed danger. He just hoped, for both their sakes, that he was wrong. He wasn't. Just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the prairie, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Not one rider, but a dozen. Harlan peered through a crack in the wall. His heart sank. It was Sheriff Dean and a posse of his deputies, riding straight for the shack. They were surrounded. "Nowhere left to run, little girl." Dean's voice boomed across the clearing, dripping with triumphant malice. "Your friend Morrison sends his regards. He was very persuasive." The trap had been sprung. Their only ally had been a traitor, and they were caught right in the middle of it. The world shrank to the four crumbling walls of the shack. Outside, a dozen men with rifles. Inside, a man with a pistol and a girl with a terrible truth. The hope they'd felt just an hour before had curdled into a cold, hard knot of despair. "Morrison was always Dean's man," Harlan said, his voice flat. He was angry at himself for not seeing it, for walking them right into this. Dean must have something on him, something he'd sell his soul to protect. "It doesn't matter now," Sylvia said, her eyes blazing with defiance. She wasn't the same girl who'd been dragged to the river. The river had washed away her fear, replacing it with a cold, hard fury. "They won't take me alive." "They won't take either of us," Harlan said. He checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 bullets. It wasn't nearly enough. "Come on out," Dean shouted from outside. "Make it easy on yourselves. I might even let the horsemen live. But you, Sylvia, you and I have a contract to discuss." Harlan saw the flicker of an idea in Sylvia's eyes. She pointed toward the rickety stone fireplace in the corner of the shack. It was clogged with years of debris and old nests. "The chimney," she mouthed. It was narrow, choked with soot, but it might be big enough for one person to squeeze through. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. "Go," Harlan whispered, pushing her toward it. "Get out the back. Run for the high rocks. I'll hold them off as long as I can." "I'm not leaving you," she shot back. "This isn't a discussion," he growled, a lifetime of command from cattle drives returning to his voice. "Your survival is the only thing that matters. If you die, the truth dies with you. Now go." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned to the single window, took a deep breath, and fired. The shot splintered the wood next to a deputy's head, sending the man scrambling for cover. The posse returned fire, bullets tearing through the thin walls of the shack, filling the small space with dust and the smell of gunpowder. Under the cover of the chaos, Sylvia scrambled into the fireplace. It was a tight fit, scratching her skin, filling her lungs with soot, but she clawed her way upward, toward the small patch of starry sky above. Harlan kept firing, one careful shot at a time, making them think he was well armed, making them keep their distance. He was buying her seconds, each one precious. Sylvia tumbled out onto the roof, gasping for air. She slid down the back and hit the ground running, plunging into the darkness of the mesquite grove. Behind her, the gunfire intensified. She didn't look back. She just ran, Harlan's words echoing in her head. "If you die, the truth dies with you." Back in the shack, Harlan was down to his last 2 bullets. The posse was getting bolder, creeping closer. He knew he had only moments left. He looked around the dilapidated room, and his eyes fell on an old rusted kerosene lamp on the mantel. An idea, born of pure desperation, sparked in his mind. With one of his last bullets, he shattered the lamp. Kerosene splashed across the dry floorboards. With his final bullet, he aimed for the cast iron stove. The bullet struck steel, sending a shower of sparks into the puddle of fuel. The room erupted in flames. The fire exploded outward, catching the dry wooden walls instantly. The deputies outside yelled in surprise, falling back from the sudden inferno. Through the smoke and flames, Harlan burst out the back door, his clothes singed, his face black with soot. He sprinted into the night in the opposite direction from where Sylvia had fled, drawing the posse after him. He was faster than they expected. He knew how to use the terrain, how to melt into the shadows. For an hour he led them on a wild chase through the rocky landscape, twisting and turning, until he finally lost them in a narrow canyon. He was free, but he was alone, unarmed, and miles from town. And Sylvia was out there somewhere, just as vulnerable. Meanwhile, Sylvia had reached the high rocks, her lungs burning, her body aching. She found a small cave to hide in, collapsing in the dark, her mind racing. They had escaped, but they had lost everything. The element of surprise, their allies, their proof. The letter and the certificate were now just ashes in the burned-out shack. She huddled in the cold, feeling a wave of despair wash over her. It was hopeless. Dean had won. But then she remembered something else. Something from her mother's letter. A line she had skimmed over, not understanding its importance at the time. "Your father kept all our important papers," her mother had written. "He said the truth must be preserved, not just on paper, but in ink that does not fade. He always kept his ledgers close, in the one place he felt truly safe, where the river meets the land." Where the river meets the land. It wasn't a poem, it was a clue. Her father's office. The small private study at the back of the ranch house. The room had a large stone fireplace built from river rocks. He kept his business ledgers in a heavy iron safe, hidden behind a loose stone in that hearth. She had seen him open it once as a child. Could it be? Had her mother and father made other copies? Had they hidden more proof? It was a wild chance, but it was the only one she had left. She had to get back to the most dangerous place in the world for her right now, her own home. The K Ranch was surely being watched by Dean's men, but it was also the place where the truth was buried. She just had to dig it up before Dean found her and buried her for good. Getting back to the ranch was a nightmare. Sylvia traveled by night, hiding during the day, her hunger a constant gnawing ache in her stomach. She drank from streams and ate wild berries, her dress torn to rags, her body covered in scratches. But the thought of the safe, of the potential proof hidden inside, drove her forward. After 2 days, she was on the ridge overlooking her home, and her heart sank. The place was crawling with Dean's men. They were camped on her porch, their horses in her corral. They were treating her home like their personal barracks. Getting inside would be impossible. Just as she was about to give up, a familiar figure rode into the ranch yard. It was Harlan. He looked exhausted and grim, but he was alive. He'd circled back, guessing she would eventually be drawn back here. He dismounted, pretending to be a drifter looking for work, and started talking to one of the deputies. Sylvia watched, her heart in her throat. After a few minutes, the deputy shook his head, and Harlan rode away, disappearing over the next hill. She knew what it was, a signal. He was drawing them away. Minutes later, from the direction Harlan had gone, a gunshot echoed through the valley. Then another. The deputies at the ranch house mounted up, cursing, and galloped off in the direction of the sound, eager for a chase. Harlan was creating a diversion. He was buying her time. She didn't waste a second. She scrambled down the ridge and ran for the house. The back door was unlocked. She slipped inside into the quiet, familiar rooms of her childhood. It felt like a lifetime ago. She crept to her father's study. The air was thick with the smell of stale cigar smoke and old leather. Her hands trembling, she knelt at the fireplace and felt along the stones. Her fingers found it, a single rock that was loose. She pried it out. Behind it was the small black door of the iron safe. It was locked with a combination dial. Her mind raced. What would the combination be? Her father wasn't a complicated man. He was a man of dates. Her mother's birthday, their anniversary, her own birthday. She tried all three. Nothing. Panic began to set in. She could hear the deputies returning in the distance. She had minutes, maybe less. She closed her eyes, trying to picture her father at his desk. What was important to him? What date defined their family? And then it hit her. The date the K Ranch was officially founded by her great-grandfather. The date carved into the main beam of the barn. 8/15/72. She spun the dial. 8/15/72. A soft click. The handle turned. She swung the heavy door open, her heart pounding. Inside, there wasn't just a copy of the marriage certificate and another letter from her mother. There was more. Much more. There was a thick, leather-bound book, her father's private ledger. She opened it. The first few pages were ranch business. But then the entries changed. They were records of payments, large sums of money paid out, month after month, year after year. Next to each payment was a name. Elwood James, General Store. Gloria Ann, school teacher. And then the name that made her gasp, Morrison, Livery Stable. Beside each name was a cryptic note. Elwood, debt covered. Gloria, brother's trouble in Austin settled. Morrison, son's cattle rustling charge, disappeared. It was all there, in her father's meticulous handwriting. He hadn't just been paying Royce Dean to stay away. He had been cleaning up Dean's messes. Dean hadn't just been extorting her family. He had been using his power as sheriff to entrap and blackmail nearly every influential person in Cedar Falls. He had a hook in all of them. He owned them. Morrison hadn't betrayed them out of simple greed. Dean had his son's life in his hands. Elwood James wasn't just afraid of a tax audit. Dean could ruin him completely. The town's silence wasn't born of simple fear. It was born of shame, of secrets, of a complex web of corruption that had its center right in the sheriff's office. This was bigger than her ranch. This was about the soul of the entire town. Dean hadn't just terrorized them. He had made them complicit in their own subjugation. And this ledger, this beautiful, terrible book, was the proof. Just then, she heard the sound of boots on the porch. The deputies were back. She slammed the safe shut, replaced the stone, and dove under her father's massive oak desk just as the study door swung open. A pair of muddy boots stopped just inches from her face. She held her breath, convinced she was about to die. The deputy scanned the room, then grunted and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Sylvia waited, her body trembling, until she heard their voices fade as they moved to the front of the house. She had the truth, a truth so powerful it could either set the whole town free or get them all killed. Now she just had to find a way to use it. Clutching the ledger, Sylvia slipped out of the house and back into the wilderness. She met Harlan at a prearranged spot, a small, hidden spring a few miles away. When she showed him the ledger, he let out a low whistle. He'd seen corruption before, but never anything this systematic, this total. "This is why they won't fight," he said, tracing a finger over the names. "He's not just holding a gun to their heads. He's holding their own lives, their own mistakes, over them. To expose him, they have to expose themselves." "So how do we fight that?" Sylvia asked, her voice heavy with the weight of the book in her hands. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Harlan's face. "You don't fight it head on, you turn it into a weapon. We can't ask them to be heroes, so we'll make it impossible for them to be cowards." Their plan was audacious. It was reckless. It was almost certainly a suicide mission, but it was the only move they had left. The next day was Sunday. The whole town would be gathered in one place, a place of supposed truth and sanctuary, the church. That's where they would make their stand. Not with guns, but with the truth. They spent the night carefully tearing specific pages from the ledger. The page with Elwood James's name, the page with Gloria Ann's, the page with Morrison's. Harlan then found a young, hungry orphan boy who sometimes ran errands for him, a kid who could move through the town unnoticed. For the price of a silver dollar, the boy agreed to deliver 3 sealed envelopes just before the Sunday service began. One to the general store, one to the schoolhouse, and one to the livery stable. Sunday morning dawned, bright and clear. The church bell tolled, calling the good, God-fearing, and utterly terrified people of Cedar Falls to worship. They filed in, dressed in their Sunday best, their faces grim. Sheriff Dean was there, of course, sitting in the front pew, the picture of piety and order. He was confident. The fugitives were gone, burned up, or run off. His secrets were safe. The service began. The opening hymn started, a weak and trembling chorus of voices. And then, the heavy oak doors of the church creaked open. The hymn faltered. Voices died out, one by one. Every head in the congregation turned. Standing in the doorway, framed by the morning sun, was Sylvia Kay. Her dress was torn and dirty, her face smudged with soot, but her back was straight and her eyes were on fire. She was not a ghost. She was a reckoning. And standing beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt, was Harlan Roy. The silence in the church was absolute. It was as if the whole town had forgotten how to breathe. Sheriff Dean rose slowly from his pew, his face a storm cloud of fury and disbelief. This was impossible. They were supposed to be dead. "Good morning," Sylvia said, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent sanctuary. "I apologize for interrupting your worship, but I wanted to let everyone know that I survived Sheriff Dean's river justice. And by his own rules, that means God himself has declared me innocent." "Blasphemy!" Dean roared, his hand instinctively going to his gun. "This woman is a fugitive from the law. Arrest her." His deputies, positioned near the back, started to move forward, but Harlan took one step into the aisle, and they froze. His eyes were like chips of ice, and there was a certainty about him that promised death. "Before you do that, Sheriff," Harlan said, his voice calm and deadly, "there's a book you might want to see." He held up the thick leather ledger. Sylvia's father was a very careful man. He kept records of all the favors he did for you, and for others. He looked directly at Elwood James, the store owner. "Like the loan you took from Dean that never seemed to get paid down, Mr. James?" Elwood went white as a sheet. He turned his gaze to Gloria Ann, the school teacher. "Or the trouble your nephew got into in Fort Worth? The trouble that just vanished?" Gloria looked like she was going to be sick. Then his eyes landed on Morrison, the liveryman, who was standing near the door, his face a mask of agony. "And you, Morrison? Your boy has a fast hand with a branding iron, doesn't he? It'd be a shame if the circuit judge found out he'd been rebranding K Ranch cattle for the last 2 years. Morrison let out a choked sob and sank to his knees. "He made me do it," he cried, the confession tearing out of him. "He said he'd hang my son. He said he'd see him swing if I didn't tell him where they were hiding." The dam had broken. The church erupted in a wave of murmurs, then shouts. The poison was out. People were looking at Dean not with fear, but with dawning, furious comprehension. They finally understood the true nature of their prison. They hadn't been protected by the law. They had been caged by it. Dean's face was purple with rage. His authority, his entire empire of fear, was crumbling around him in a house of God. He was exposed, cornered, and a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. "Lies," he bellowed, finally drawing his pistol. "All of it. Slander from a common criminal and a delusional girl." He pointed the gun at Sylvia. "I'll see you all in hell." But before he could fire, several men from the congregation, men who had been silent for years, surged forward. Elwood James, the quiet storekeeper, a blacksmith named Peterson, 2 ranchers from the edge of town. They formed a human shield in front of Sylvia. For the first time, the town was standing up. "No more, Royce," Elwood said, his voice shaking but firm. "It's over." Dean's eyes were wild. He whistled sharply. 2 more of his enforcers, who had been waiting outside, appeared in the doorway, rifles at the ready. The church had become a tinderbox, a standoff between a corrupt lawman and a town that had finally found its voice. "You've all lost your minds," Dean screamed. "You'll all pay for this." "There's only one way to settle this, Sheriff," Sylvia said, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You claim to respect the old ways, the old laws. I challenge you, trial by combat, here and now." A malicious grin spread across Dean's face. This was a language he understood. "Trial by combat it is," he hissed. "Pistols, in the street, 20 paces." He looked at Sylvia with contempt. Unless you plan on fighting me yourself? She has the right to choose a champion, Harlan said, stepping forward into the aisle, the ledger now tucked securely under his arm. And I volunteer to stand for Miss Kay. The die was cast. The entire town spilled out of the church into the dusty main street. It wasn't just a duel for one woman's life anymore. It was a duel for the soul of Cedar Falls. Harlan and Dean took their positions, the crowd forming a wide, silent circle around them. Harlan felt a strange calm settle over him. For 14 years, he'd been running from a fight he couldn't win, the fight against his own guilt. But this was a fight he could win. This was a man he could face. He wasn't just fighting for Sylvia. He was fighting for Emma. He was fighting for the man he should have been all those years ago. 20 paces, called Gloria Ann, her voice surprisingly strong. Turn and fire on my count of 3. They walked their paces, their boots kicking up dust, their backs to each other. The world seemed to go silent. The wind died down. The only sound was the thumping of Harlan's own heart. They turned. 20 paces apart, two men stood locked in a moment that would define the rest of their lives. Dean was smiling, confident. He was a killer. Harlan's face was a stone mask. He was a survivor. But as Gloria Ann opened her mouth to start the count, Sylvia, who was watching from the church steps, saw something. A flash of light, a glint of sun on metal, from the second-story window of the sheriff's office, directly overlooking the street. It was Calloway, Dean's young deputy, with a rifle. It was an ambush. "One!" Gloria Ann called out. Harlan raised his pistol, his eyes locked on Dean. He was focused, ready. 2! "Harlan, the window!" Sylvia screamed, her voice ripping through the silence. 3! Everything happened at once. As Dean drew his pistol, the rifle shot cracked from the window above. Harlan, reacting to Sylvia's warning, threw himself to the side. The rifle bullet tore through the air where his chest had been a second before, splintering the church door behind him. Dean's own shot went wide, kicking up dust at Harlan's feet. The duel was a sham. The townspeople roared in outrage. The blacksmith, Peterson, charged toward the sheriff's office to deal with the sniper. The other ranchers tackled Dean's deputies. The street erupted into a full-blown brawl. In the midst of the chaos, it came back down to the two men. Harlan pushing himself up from the dust, and Dean, his face contorted in a snarl of fury, realizing his plan had failed. Dean fired again, wildly this time. Harlan took a steadying breath, aimed not with anger, but with a cold, clear purpose, and squeezed the trigger. His shot was true. The bullet struck Dean in the shoulder, the same one holding the gun. The pistol clattered to the dust. The sheriff spun around and fell to the ground, clutching his wounded arm, a look of shocked disbelief on his face. The fight was over. The brawling stopped. Calloway was dragged, weeping, from the sheriff's office. The deputies surrendered. The entire town slowly closed in, forming a tight, silent circle around the man who had terrorized them for 8 long years. Dean looked up at their faces, and for the first time, he saw not fear, but pure, unadulterated contempt. His power was broken. His reign was over. Sylvia walked up and stood over him, Harlan at her side. "You're finished here, Royce," she said, her voice devoid of hatred, filled only with a weary finality. "Leave Cedar Falls and never come back." Harlan knelt down and picked up Dean's silver badge from the dust. He looked at it for a moment, then tossed it to Morrison. "This town needs a new sheriff," he said. "Someone who remembers what it's like to be afraid." Within a week, Cedar Falls was a different place. With the ledger as evidence, a circuit judge issued warrants for Royce Dean and his cronies, charging them with a list of crimes so long it took an hour to read. They discovered a map in his office, detailing a network of properties he'd been acquiring across the territory through similar means of extortion and murder. His capture didn't just save one town. It unraveled a criminal empire. The town elected Morrison as their interim sheriff, a man now fiercely dedicated to earning back the trust he had broken. The money extorted by Dean, recovered from a hidden bank account, was used to build a new schoolhouse. The townspeople, no longer bound by their secrets, began to talk to each other again, to trust each other again. Sylvia Kay, with the help of the community, got the K Ranch running better than ever. Harlan Roy stayed. He found that after 14 years of running, standing still felt pretty good. He sold his string of horses and bought a small plot of land adjoining Sylvia's, and their partnership deed, signed 6 months later, was a symbol not just of business, but of a shared future built from the ashes of a shared past. Sometimes late at night, Harlan would sit on the porch of the new home they were building together, the Texas wind whispering through the cottonwoods. He'd take out the faded photograph of Emma and tell her all about the brave woman who had faced down a monster and taught him that it's never too late to stop running. That redemption isn't about forgetting the past, but about building a future worthy of its memory. In the back of her father's old ledger, on a clean, empty page, Sylvia made one last entry. We discovered that courage, like a prairie fire, is contagious. One person willing to stand can give an entire community the permission to rise. People always wonder if you can build something beautiful from the ruins of what someone tried to destroy. Here in Cedar Falls, we learn the answer is always yes, if you're brave enough to try. This story is a powerful reminder that the darkest shadows are often cast by those who stand closest to the light of the law. But it also shows that the courage of just one or two people can be enough to bring the truth to bear. If you enjoyed this story, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good tale of frontier justice. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on all notifications because you have no idea what kind of story I have waiting for you tomorrow. Thanks for listening.